Now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce, excuse me, I left my notes back in my lodging, so I've got to read it from the web. I do apologise. Here we are. To introduce Professor David Cantrill, who is an Executive Director of the Science Division here. Is that since 2006? And some of you, if you've listened to the Botanic Gardens month in May, and Costa was actually interviewing different people during that month, well, one of them just happened to be David, so you might recognise some of the things he says. He's responsible for leading research into plant biodiversity, systematics, conservation and management of the state botanical collection with statutory responsibility under the Royal Botanic Gardens Act 1991 and the Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Act 1981. Professor Cantrill worked as a senior research scientist in Europe for 15 years, first for the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge and later at the Swedish Museum of Natural History in Stockholm. He has published over 120 scientific articles, is an editor of Grana, an international journal for pollen studies, and sits on a number of international editorial and scientific advisory boards. His research interests focus on integrating information from fossil and living floras to understanding the origins of patterns of diversity in the Southern Hemisphere. And he holds an honorary professorship with the School of Biosciences at the University of Melbourne. So please join me in welcoming David.
Thanks very much, Rosemary. Can everyone hear okay? Yep, good. That saves me really projecting quite a long way back. So before I start, I always like to take a bit of a temperature of the room. Do we have any retired geologists amongst us? Or current geologists? No? Oh, that's good. I can get away with some geological liberties then. But today I want to talk a little bit about Gondwana and fossil plants. And the term Gondwana is probably something some people are familiar with and others maybe less so. But it's a term that's bandied around a lot. And I'm sure many of you will be aware of the Gondwana Rainforest World Heritage Area, where a whole series of remnant vegetation patches of rainforest have been amalgamated into a World Heritage listed item. But what does that actually mean? Gondwana rainforest. And when you talk to people about Gondwana rainforest, you come up with a whole range of different views. So I just want to explore that a little bit for the next 45 minutes to an hour. But if you look at the World Heritage listing advice, part of that listing advice states that this Gondwana Rainforest of Australia has a wide range of plant and animal lineages and communities with ancient origins in Gondwana. So that's not to say that the forests are the same forests that were growing on Gondwana, which is what we often hear, but they contain components of that flora and fauna from time deep in history. So before I talk about that, I just want to touch on this chap who some of you may recognise, J.D. Hooker. Hooker took part in the Erebus and Terror expeditions and sailed with James Clark Ross around the world, and he was the naturalist on board. And one of his great observations was that the plants and animals, to some extent, in the Southern Hemisphere continents all bore a remarkable resemblance. And the resemblance that he noted led him to state that this similarity in pattern between South America and Australia and New Zealand and various other places that they travelled implied some common connection and that the biotas of those lands were once shared. Of course, This was prior to our understanding of the role that Antarctica played in that, but it was a very salient observation, and it was really the foundation of a field of study we call biogeography, which is looking at distributions of organisms, identifying common patterns of those distributions, and trying to work out what they might mean. One of the points that they stopped at on that expedition is illustrated in the expedition volumes, and this is a place called Cockburn Island. It's in the Antarctic Peninsula, and they stopped and they landed on this island. I don't quite know why, because it's pretty formidable and imposing, and there's a lot of land nearby that would be far easier to get to shore. But they landed here, and he actually collected some lichens from this island. This is what it looks like when I was down there a long time ago now, but you can see this very steep talus slope and then vertical cliffs on the top. And that flat cliff at the top is actually volcanics, and underneath it sit a range of sediments. And just to give you a bit of context about where that is, we're on the Antarctic Peninsula. You can see that little area at the top, James Ross Island, and there's a blow-up map showing James Ross Island, Snow Hill Island, Seymour Island, and then this little tiny speck between the two called Cockburn Island, just off to the right. If they'd landed on anywhere else but Cockburn Island, they would have found a mass of fossils. And in particular, if they'd landed on Seymour Island, they would have found trunks of trees, and we can see this fossilised trunk from the Eocene that comes from Seymour Island. And you can note here the whorls of scars around it, so we know from that this was a monopodal habit. We know from the anatomy of that specimen that it belongs to the Araucariaceae, and you can even see impression of the bark on that particular fossil. You also find standing trees down there, pointing to a very different climate. And there are a whole range of leaf fossils, not necessarily from Seymour Island, but from other islands on the Antarctic Peninsula, that tell the story of what plants and what vegetation grew there. And if Hooker had collected on Seymour Island, this fossil's actually from the Beardmore Glacier, but on Seymour Island you find Nothofagus, those same beech trees that he observed in South America and New Zealand and Australia, and helped reach those conclusions about the similarity of the Southern Hemisphere flora. And here's an example of southern South America today, where you get Nothofagus forests right down onto, even grows on glacial moraine, ice-cooled glacial moraine. So you can see there's a real relationship in terms of coldness and the tolerance of this particular plant. So that sort of founded you think of that as a sort of a foundation for the study of biogeography, of the study of these distributions and those observations. And that's a field that's, very alive today. But at some time, much later, we then started to think about geological events and how that might work. And based on those geological events, there was sort of this idea that there was a Gondwana flora or Gondwana biota. So what is Gondwana, and is that really relevant? So this is a map of Gondwana, how it would have looked about 250 million years ago, where South America, Africa, India, Antarctica and Australia are all joined together, along with Madagascar and New Zealand and a few other islands. I hope there's no New Zealanders in the audience that I'll upset, but a few other smaller islands. But the thing with Gondwana is that it was a concept that came through the geological research. And it came through geological research through Du Toit, who was one of the first people that recognised that there was a strong concordance between the coastal outline of South America and Africa, and those two things looked like they should fit together. And that led to this notion that the continents weren't fixed on the globe. And supporting that thought was a whole range of fossil evidence. So similar fossils that are now widely separated by oceans occurring on the same continent, and combined with the fact that our understanding of the biology of them was that they couldn't swim across these great big oceans, so there must have been some way the land masses were connected. And there's two observations to make when you look at this sort of original sketch idea that we can see. Some of these things, the animals are distributed across the whole area, and others are restricted to different parts of the continent, of this big land mass. And that's important when we think about what does it mean in terms of Gondwana. And I'll come on to that in a little bit. And the other thing with the plants is the plants are very widespread. They're characterised by a thing called Glossopteris. Glossopteris is a great big long-leafed plant. The leaves can be up to 30 or 40 centimetres long, big spatulate or ovate shaped leaves, and they grow on a tree. In fact, Glossopteris is responsible for most of the coal deposits that we currently are still digging up. So things like, in New South Wales, Hunter Valley deposits, in Africa, in South America and in India, those Permian swamps were dominated by Glossopteris, and they produced huge amounts of material that was trapped in the peat swamps and turned to coal. And you find those same coal deposits in the Antarctic. So they're a really significant plant in the landscape, and they pointed to a connection across that region. So all those areas were thought to be connected because they contained a plant that couldn't really disperse across oceans. There's an awful lot of research around showing how the continents broke up. And I think there's sort of two things to think about here. It's really about what happened to those continents as Gondwana broke up, as it separated into the familiar fragments that we know today. And there's a couple of things to see when you look at how the continents break up. They all have a different trajectory. So some of them, like Antarctica, stays in the southern high latitudes. So you might expect that to have a much more stable climate through time because it stays in the same topographic area. Other continents like India, well, you can't even see India on here because India drifted northwards very quickly, went through the tropical belt, and then ran into Asia and formed the Himalayas. So the history of that bit of land is quite different to the history of Antarctica. It travelled at great speed. It went from temperate climates to tropical climates to temperate climates, and then formed alpine and all sorts of other things. And each one of those fragments each has a very different history. And of course, we know that there's a strong link between climate and what sort of vegetation you've got. So it's unsurprising that that has an influence on what the vegetation and what plants are left there today. And I think that's sort of an important point here. So here we can see by the Miocene, or late Oligocene, so about 23 million years ago, let's say, a lot of Antarctica was glaciated. So we've gone from probably a temperate climate with large forests producing these big coal seams 250 million years ago to a climate that's dominated by ice and all the rest of it. And of course, there's physiological parameters on tree growth, which means trees can't grow there any longer. And all of that information is preserved in the fossil record. So I just put this in to remind me of what I've just been saying, so you can sort of read that. Gondwana defines a geographic area, a big landmass that contains the future continents. The fragmentation of Gondwana progressively isolated those biotas, and as a result they had very different evolutionary histories. Yet, the common patterns of distribution that we see, such as in Nothofagus, shows that some of that history is preserved. And that's really what we're trying to disentangle, what we're trying to discover is what is that history and how is it reflected in the modern floras. So, what is Gondwana? We've had a definition. It's this landmass here. So, if we're thinking about distributions of plants, say we're talking about the Gondwana Rainforests of Australia, we might suspect or we might think that those plants were distributed across the whole of Gondwana. That's sort of the logical thing, and that's the way biogeographers think about things, is you've got a common land area with a common flora or fauna. It gets broken, those things evolve in isolation, but there is still some evolutionary link between them, and then there's further fragmentation. But of course, as soon as you break that continent, is it still Gondwana? And that's where some of the confusion comes in about when we talk about Gondwana, maybe not to everyone, but certainly in the world I live in, it's clarity of thought or lack of clarity of thought. And so if we look at how Gondwana fragmented, it really broke into two parts first, what we refer to as Western Gondwana and Eastern Gondwana. So really, if we're looking at the biota, and I'll just back to this slide, if we're looking at the biota, is something that evolves and sits on Western Gondwana really Gondwanan, or is it Western Gondwanan? Or is it Eastern Gondwanan? And when you look at all the things that we talk about as being Gondwanan today, none of them, well, there are a few exceptions, a lot of them aren't really Gondwanan. Because Gondwana existed as a landmass until about 184 million years ago, and that was when it started to break up. Yet many of the things that we talk about as being Gondwanan, like Nothofagus for example, they only evolved at about 83 million years. So Gondwana had already split up for more than 100 million years before that group evolved. So there's the sort of the conundrum that you face when we're talking about modern plants out there. Are they really Gondwanan or not? And in the majority of cases, they're probably not, in my view. Because of course there's another dimension to this, and the other dimension is what are you trying to communicate and what are you trying to engage the public with. So now I'll get into some horrible diagrams. So hopefully your lunch is partially digested and you're not falling asleep. But this is how we often look at area relationships when looking at biogeography, or evolutionary relationships when we're looking at species. We build these branching diagrams that reflect what we think of as reality. And the one thing that I'd point out here is this is a breakup sequence of Gondwana. It's not necessarily the correct one. There's other ways of looking at it, of course, as with any science. There's various ways of interpreting the data. But really what you see here is you see that bottom group, New Zealand, New Caledonia, South America, Australia and New Guinea. That's really the area that we're talking about that contains most of the taxa that we talk about as being Gondwanan. And to illustrate that, I'll come back to Nothofagus. So you will have seen how Gondwana initially split into sort of two bits. Well, Nothofagus has an exceptional fossil record. It's probably one of the best fossil records we've got of living taxa. It is wind pollinated, so it produces a lot of pollen, and that pollen gets into the sediments and fossilises, along with the foliage and other things. And so the record we've got is really rather exceptional. And when we look at that record, that family of plants appears in the fossil record about 84 million years ago, and it appears across Antarctica, South America, the Antarctic Peninsula, Marybird Land, New Zealand or Zealandia, Australia and New Guinea. There's no record of Nothofagus in Africa. There's no record of Nothofagus in Madagascar. There's no record of Nothofagus in India. And that's because those bits of Gondwana had already separated and there was already an extensive sea between them and where Nothofagus evolved. So is Nothofagus Gondwanan? No, it's only partially Gondwanan and it's really eastern Gondwanan in its distribution. And I am happy to take questions as we go along. I should have said that at the start. I'll just pause there for a second to see if anyone wants to raise a question at this point before I plough on with the next bit of the talk.
On one of the programs I was listening, 9 Parts of Sleep, I'll grant you at night, they were saying Tasmania was not part of Gondwana. Tasmania came from a different area, is that correct?
No, Tasmania's part of Gondwana. Yeah, it's part of the Australian plate, and it's separated from the Antarctic at about 33 million.
I think there's confusion because there's this little piece of Tasmania which came from North America, as I understand it. It's just a little piece.
Yeah, so some of that stuff is way before Gondwanan time. So prior to Gondwana, all the continents were in different shapes, and there's various other continents that precede Gondwana. There's Baltica, there's Laurentia, there's Pangaea. So all those bits have moved around through time, but Gondwana assembled at about 500 million years ago. So even though there's little bits of North America in Tasmania and other places, that was all amalgamated into Gondwana at about 500 million years. And I'm really just talking about the point since then.
Yes, just double checking about the map of Gondwana that we traditionally see. We have
Yeah.
one up there that shows actually the blue bits of sea between the segmented, Africa, etc. Were they actually physically, or was it all one landmass?
It was all one landmass. So the problem we have with the reconstructions is as the continents break up, the continental crust thins. And as it thins, it then fractures. And it's only once you get a seaway forming that you form what's called mid-ocean ridge basalts and you start getting oceanic sea crust. And that's when we can start to see what the timing is of how they moved apart. And so it's that early bit of history that we can't easily unravel. And so when they reconstruct them, they sort of take them back to the ocean boundary, the continent, what's called the continent-ocean boundary, and then after that it's a bit of guesswork because of the way the crusts are stretched, and there's all sorts of things that go on. So the reconstructions either go back to that COB, continent-ocean boundary, and then you've got a little bit of a seaway there because they don't quite perfectly match. And there's other reconstructions which they call tight fit reconstructions, which work on a number of other assumptions, but even those don't close the land masses completely. So you can assume they're one land mass. Yep. Well, the relatives live in Madagascar, so you've got this really bizarre distribution, and that's part of this thing, trying to understand distributions, not just the common ones, but also those unusual ones. So Africa and the Kimberley, and the conundrum that you have is that baobabs evolved much later than when the continents split apart. So how did they get there? We don't really know, and there's couple of different lines of thought on that. And Dan Murphy here's been working with some people on baobab evolution, but also with some people that study languages. And when you study languages, you find that the evolution of the language parallels the genetic evolution of the group in Australia. So they're clearly being moved around by people as well. Now, whether they got bought from Africa originally, there's still a lot to learn in that space, and I don't think we've fully got across that. Right, I might keep going, otherwise Rosemary's going to get the hook out and hook me off the stage. So the other bit of the equation, so we've talked about Gondwana and those patterns, and how some of the patterns we see aren't really Gondwana, and they're later patterns that have developed as Gondwana's broken up. One of the other assumptions that we tend to see is that because a lineage of plants or animals is old, it must be Gondwanan. Makes sense, makes perfect sense. But you've got to recognise that these things do move around, and I want to use one example that we've got before I get onto the fossils. So Nymphaeales, water lilies, 3 families in the water lilies. Nymphaeaceae is probably the one that most people are aware of, and this is a very ancient lineage. It's right near the base of the flowering plant tree, so it's a very old lineage, and you might say, well, it's an old lineage, it's in Australia, therefore it's probably Gondwanan. Reasonable assumption. And I'll put up another horrible branching diagram. I don't want you to read any of the names here. The key message here is someone's looked at the evolution of this group. They've taken all the plants from all over the world, they've ground them up, they've got the DNA out, they've run them through the programs that analyse the relationships, and these are the relationships between the various groups of water lilies. And the interesting thing is the Anisophia at the top is the Australian clade of water lilies, and that clade of water lilies is very recent. Very recent. So although they're a part of our flora, a natural part of our flora, they've actually evolved fairly recently. And when you look at the group that's most closely related to them, you find that it's Asian. And so this is where making the assumption that something's an ancient lineage and therefore it must be Gondwanan doesn't necessarily hold, because as Australia moved northwards, as Gondwana broke up, it ran into Asia. And when it ran into Asia, some things from Asia came down here and some things from Australia went up there. And that's what we're seeing in the water lilies. We're seeing the impact of Australia running into Asia and some groups of organisms able to cross that bridge, get into Australia, and then evolve into a range of new species. So it's just a little lesson for us biologists. Just because something's old doesn't mean that it's Gondwana, and doesn't mean that it was always in Australia. And there's just what I've said, just to remind myself to say it. So if we then turn to the fossil record, our knowledge of the fossil record is improving all the time. It's also changing the way we think about plant distributions and what might be Gondwanan. And I've got a few examples to run through, just to show you, some of you may be aware of these things, just to show you some of the changes in our state of knowledge. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about relates to a really unique deposit in southern South America. This is a deposit in Patagonia. I've been very fortunate to do field work there. It's a place called Laguna de Huanco. Now, if any of you are wealthy enough, the whole estancia that it's on is for sale at the moment. So if you want to buy a world-class fossil deposit, it's up for sale. The only problem is Argentinian law would not allow you to export any fossils from it, because their laws in that space are very tight. All fossils must stay in country. But just a little aside. And it really is somewhere that's in the middle of nowhere. So it takes a full day of four-wheel driving off-road to get to this site. But it's remarkable. And so you can see all those white layers there, and they're all parts of a Mar lake. So this is a volcanic, there's a big volcano. This deposit's about 30 kilometres across. and it was a crater lake that was about 30 kilometres across. So just to give you some idea of the scale of the volcano that was there, and every time it erupted, an ash layer would start filling in the lake, and if there are any plants or animals floating on the surface or had fallen in, they got buried, and so you get this remarkable sequence of rocks that contains a fantastic suite of plants. It's one of the most diverse localities in the world of this age. They've done some rarefaction studies on it that show the species diversity is enormously high. And what we're seeing there is we're seeing Eocene rainforest. So this is rainforest that's about 54 million years old, and it just has a massive diversity of things. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. The collaborators that work on this, we're still describing new things, and there's whole families that haven't even been dealt with. And when you put this slide up, if you don't, if I hadn't told you all that background, you'd go, wow, they're really nice casuarina fossils. We know casuarina is a group that's only in the Southwest Pacific. It must be a flora from Australia or the Southwest Pacific or something like that. But here in this South American flora, we have very good gymnostoma. So gymnostoma is a thing that grows in Queensland and New Caledonia and some other places. It tends to be on the rivers, often in flooded environments. But here in this crater lake, 54 million years ago, we've got good gymnostoma. So thinking about distributions, of course, all of a sudden our little minds are blown. We've gone from, I really thought that group was Southwest Pacific to, no, it was all the way across into South America. Was it in Antarctica? Well, we haven't got any fossils from there yet, but I'm sure it'll turn up there and other places. So that distribution today is clouded by extinction. And really this group could have been another one of those Eastern Gondwanan groups like Nothofagus. This is another example from the same deposit. Beautifully preserved leaves, and importantly cone material, because we need those cones to be able to identify what type of conifer it is. And this thing belongs to the genus Populocedrus, found, not surprisingly, in New Guinea today. It's an extant member of the Cupressaceae. Now it's also known from this South American flora. So another group that all of a sudden becomes a lot more widespread than we had thought. We'd thought a lot of these conifers that are in those sorts of environments are maybe a bit more recent. They've evolved to peculiar montane environments and things, but in fact they were much more widespread in the past. And this is the one that people may or may not be aware about, but this was the one that really caused a lot of discussion at the time. You can see these leaves here. They have a very clear marginal or intramarginal vein to them, so that's a vein right on the edge of the leaf. You can see these dots on the surface which represent oil bodies. And when you look at other plants that are around, you'd say it's a member of the Myrtaceae. It's that intermarginal vein and oil dots are good characters for that. But for years and years, no one believed that eucalyptus could occur in South America. It's such an iconic Australian plant. It does get up into Asia in one or two species, but really it's Australian. So paleobotanists didn't believe these records of eucalyptus in South America for a long time. They could swallow that they were Myrtaceae, but not eucalyptus. Within this deposit, there are fantastic flowers and fruits and a whole raft of other things. So these are all, well, apart from D, which is a living thing, these are all pictures of the fruits and flowers that were found in Laguna de Huenco. Capsules, you've you've got the operculum scars, you've got a range of other things. Recent work that they've done, they've managed to get pollen out of the anthers, which is clearly myrtaceae. And we know from the character suite that they're probably something in the Cynthia myrtus. So they're not very basal or primitive eucalyptus, they're quite derived group of eucalyptus. So we've gone from a situation where we thought eucalyptus was Australian, probably evolved in Australia, been there for a while. The record of eucalyptus in Australia is not that great, actually. There's not that many good fossils. There's some material from Berwick. If you've been out to the Botanic Gardens there, the site's now flooded, but there's some material from Berwick. There's a few other places where we get eucalypt fossils, but the record's not that great. And so it really looks like it's a group that has evolved or diversified very recently, but it does have this very old history. And here we have some very advanced members of the group that are 54 million years old that are from South America. So that sort of changes our understanding of the Australian flora somewhat, but it could be that these group are also part of that eastern Gondwana and much more widespread biota. And the question really is given how successful they are here and how successful they are as weeds in South America today, why the hell did they go extinct? You know, who knows? But you know, they did go extinct in South America, and that sort of clouded our view, made us think these things are very Australian when they're not. That's just 3 examples. There are a whole raft of other groups I could go on all day, but I'm not allowed to. But there are a whole raft of other groups in there. But I did want to touch on one of the other groups. So Acacia is a group that we also, like eucalyptus, think of as Australian. You know, 1,000 plus species. It's pretty much across the whole country. It gets into, in a way, it's more successful than eucalypt. It gets into the drier country. Very diverse group, more diverse than eucalyptus. When we look at the pollen of acacia, and here you can see a pollen grain. These are things called polyads. So acacia doesn't disperse single grains. When they make the pollen grains, they aggregate together into these polyads, and that's a polyad that has 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 16 pollen grains aggregated together. So the 4 facing ones, there's 4 on the other face, and then there's the ones around the outside. And a lot of things in that family produce this type of pollen. There's a lot of polyads in that group. The distinctive thing about acacia pollen is what we call these pseudosulci, but you can see there's the thickened margin, and then there's sort of a furrow, and then there's a central bit of the grain. That's only seen in acacia. So it's a character that defines the acacia genus, which means when we look in the fossil record, we can be pretty confident if it's acacia or if it's some other sort of mimozoid. And when we look at the fossil record of that pollen, we find that acacia here only goes back to about 30 million years ago. There's a few equivocal records that are a little bit older. So acacia doesn't have a big fossil history here, although it is so diverse. And it's interesting when you think of that in terms of the little vignette I gave about water lilies, because the sister group to acacia is Paracerianthes, and Paracerianthes is an Asian group. So what we think now is that acacia is a relatively recent diversification of a group that's come in after our collision with Asia. So Australia's collided with Asia, some groups have come south, the Paracerianthes lineage, for some reason it's awfully successful and it's diversified across the continent. And it may well be this pollen structure that we see that's led to that success. So when we look at the pollen of Paracerianthes, there are a couple of species that almost have this structure. It's not quite, but it's almost this structure. And those furrows and things are thought to relate to water status. So they allow the grains to be quite dry, but when there's enough water, when they need to germinate and pollinate the flower, those furrows allow the grains to expand. So there's some sort of, it's got a particular term, I won't use it because it's about this long and I can't say it, but it could be something like that. That's actually that the evolution of that particular character is what's one of the things that's led to their success. And we've just been doing some work here. We've just published 2 weeks ago, I think, the first genetic sequence for acacia. So we've looked at Acacia pycnantha, golden wattle, and we've just sequenced the genome in that. We've got a lot of analysis to do, but it is interesting when we look at that genome, because within that genome there are gene families that are what we call expanded. There's lots of copies of certain genes, and that may be giving us some clues about why this group's so successful. So just to wrap up, I think I've given you a little vignette about Gondwana, a little vignette about what is Gondwana and whether we should be using that term or not, and a little bit of fossil history about how the fossil history is changing our views on plant distribution and biogeography. And so I'm very happy to take questions, use up my fully allotted time before Rosemary hooks me off the stage. So I'll throw it open to questions. Yep.
I just have a question relating to the acacia. What about the Vaccalia, previously known as acacia from South Africa? So how does that, is there actually a historical connection there?
No, so when we look at the evolutionary tree, we have acacia with 1,000 species, then we have Paracerianthes, which is this sister group, then there are about 60 genera of a thing, which is a tribe called Ingi, and these occur through the tropics. Cerianthes, there's a whole raft of different things. They all have polyads, they're all quite different. And then you get down to these small clades like Vaccalia and Senegalia and things that used to be in acacia. They're very removed in an evolutionary sense, and they're very different in terms of their pollen and various other things.
What about the Proteaceae?
What about the Proteaceae? Well, since that's a group I work on, I left that out. Proteaceae are an interesting one because unlike, Nothofagus and that, where they're confined to eastern Gondwana, Proteaceae do occur in western Gondwana as well. As we know, Africa. There are good fossil records in India as well. How that all got there, given that those land masses had split apart, is a little bit of an interesting question. But I think one of the things that we don't fully understand about the geological breakup sequence is these things that are called, things like Kerguelen Island, the Kerguelen Islands, for example. So the Kerguelen Plateau, which has Heard Island and the Kerguelen Islands, is actually a microcontinent. It's underlain by continental crust. So when India and Africa separated, this bit of continental crust was left in between, and how long that stayed above sea level and what sort of biotic connection it might have provided, we just don't know, because it's enormously expensive to go and drill there and get information and all the rest of it. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions in that space. But when you look at Proteaceae, there's the 3 subfamilies. The Personioid and Balladini and Placosperma, they're all at the base of the tree. They're all Australian. The next subfamily is the one that contains most of the African things, but it's also got Australian, New Guinea and New Caledonia things in it. So that group was probably more widespread. The Grevillioid is largely eastern Gondwanan, so it's what you see in South America, New Zealand, Australia and those places. So it's much more recent. The only thing that throws a spanner in the works is that there's one taxon in Africa, Bragibum, that belongs in that subfamily. So we still don't quite understand it all. And of course there could be dispersal, but biogeographies don't like, or sort of biogeography that I'm into doesn't like using dispersal as an explanation because it's just a random stochastic thing, whereas we're looking for consistent patterns and processes that underpin those patterns. Does that help?
Keep up the good work. Yeah, I had the same question about the Araucarias. It looks superficially seems fairly straightforward. Not a lot of reluctance for the species in the Pacific grow off. Is it that straightforward, or is it a family with incredible history?
It's not quite that straightforward, but it is one of those groups that you probably say is Gondwana because they go back to that period of time. So they were widespread across that landmass and across the Northern Hemisphere for that matter. The challenges with some of those things is there's a group of fossils that occur in South America and some other places that are thought to be related to Bunya. And so that's sort of how a lot of the understanding's been developed. But there's some recent work that suggests they may not be that close, and this is actually an extinct group near the base, and then there's some other things in the Araucaria. And I guess, you know, the thing with Willemia being discovered, that's sort of thrown some other perceptions in there, because the Willemia lineage, there's good pollen structure that we can trace, and Willemia seems to be closest to Agathis, to the Kauri pines, and there are some cuticular, so if you look at the leaf cuticles of Agathis and Willemia, there's some features in that are consistent and, you know, help define that group. And we see them in a lot of extinct conifers, things called Podozoides and that are pretty widespread in the Cretaceous. So although Agathis, you know, is sort of, again, Southwest Pacific and everything, there's good Agathis in that South American flora as well. I didn't put that one, didn't put that example in, so it was much more widespread as a group. The one thing I would say about Araucaria is, you know, there's this diversity in New Caledonia that we're all familiar with. But that diversity is only one small group of Araucaria. It's the name eludes me at the moment. It's one group. The interesting thing about that is when we look at the molecular data for that, they're all very similar. There's not a lot of differences between them, which suggests they're all relatively recent radiations. And the other interesting thing that's come out in the last probably 5 or 6 years is when we look at the Loyalty Islands, New Caledonia was here, the Loyalty Islands have run into them, and what little signal we've got in the genetics suggests the coastal form is the most basal of that group. And so there's some thought that maybe it was a group that was on the Loyalty Islands, it's run into New Caledonia, it's hopped onto New Caledonia, and then it's gone up the hill and evolved into all these other forms. So it's one of those cases where the concentration of diversity might actually be misleading about the evolutionary history.
Something that long ago was so long time and needed for further evolution.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, it does. And what you've got preserved as well in terms of the information, because, you know, you've only got what you can see. Yeah.
You talked about Australia colliding with Asia. Where does that leave the Wallace line in all this?
Well, the Wallace line's a manifestation of that. I think the easiest way to think about things like the Wallace line, and you know, if you look at that literature, there's hundreds of different lines that various biogeographers have put in there. But of course, what one organism sees as a barrier to migration isn't necessarily what another organism sees. And so it's not surprising that you've got a number of different ways of cutting that up. And really what Wallace's line is telling us is that there's some sort of collision zone there and some sort of faunal exchange and floral exchange. And it's not as straightforward as just one line, that's it, bang, Australia, Malesia or Asia. You look at, back to the Proteaceae, you look at things like Helicia, for example. So Helicia's basal things are Australian. It's something that's managed to get across Wallace's line that goes all the way up into China, and it's quite diverse through the tropics. So it's one group that's escaped, and it hasn't stopped at Wallace's line. But I think the interesting thing is when you look at it, there's probably more things that have come into Australia than have actually gone out of Australia. That's sort of the interesting thing of that particular story. Very good. We've got still got some more time, but yep. And they're all different genera. yeah, they all come off different genera. It just sort of shows the challenge of using common names, I think, as opposed to the scientific names. Yeah. So there is a mimosa scientific name, but then there's a whole lot of things that are applied to mimosa. Same way as we apply a whole lot of things to wattle or, yeah. Yeah, probably loads. Yeah.
Are there any further queries?
No.
Stand by the microphone. Thank you for a fascinating talk, and for me, it's elucidated, as far as I understand it, quite a lot more about Gondwana that I didn't know, the conundrums associated